This month we have a talk from Eric Branse-Instone, who it's always nice to introduce a colleague. Myself and Eric both work for Historic England. So Eric has been working for many, many years on heritage designation. So he graduated from Sheffield University in prehistoric archaeology and clearly had enough of that and came to work for David Cranstone, who some of you will be aware of. Eric worked for David Cranstone's industrial archaeology consultancy in Gateshead for many, many years. He joined English Heritage in 1996, assessing sites primarily in North Yorkshire and later expanding into areas such as designation of battlefields and listed buildings. In his talk, he's coming very much back to his roots. Eric's the son of a railway engineer, so this is very, very appropriate. And he was the Historic England lead on the designations for the Stockton and Darlington Heritage Action Zone, which he will explain with, I think, a talk that many of us would be very interested in, a talk that's very close to the heart of the Northeast. So without further ado, I welcome Eric.
I'm Eric Branse-Instone. I'm a listing advisor for Historic England. So I assess buildings for listing, archaeology for scheduling, parks and gardens and battlefields for registration. I mainly cover North Yorkshire, but because my father worked for British Rail, he was a bridge engineer. The standard British Rail footbridge of the 1950s was designed by my dad, for instance. When Historic England decided to do a heritage action zone for the Stockton Darlington Railway, I put my hand up in the air to look after the listing side of things. The Heritage Action Zone ran from 2018 until 2023, although it's still generating work, as this talk demonstrates. So anyway, so let's kick off. No, don't press the screen. Yeah, my new laptop's a touch screen and this one isn't. There we go. Right, okay. So one of the key partners of Heritage Action Zone was a very active Friends group, the Friends of the Stockton Darlington Railway. And they've got a very good website, which I would encourage you to check out. They've also just published the glossy coffee table book, which I'm meant to actually get out of my bag and wave about at various times, but I'll do that later. Which they're selling in order to raise money to try to buy the railway station at Hayington. Now, I'm showing you this here because putting this talk together, I realised that a lot of my photos were absolutely awful. Most of my assessment work was actually done during COVID, and I didn't take nearly as many photos as I would normally take. So I've actually pinched a lot of images from this book, so hence the plug. Right, so to kick off, what makes the Stockton Darlington Railway, the SNDR, so special? What's all the fuss about Rail 200, celebrating the bicentenary of its opening? After all, railways have been built earlier. Of course, there's the wagonways of the Northeast coalfield. On the left, no, right as you look at it, is illustration from Les Turnbull's paper published last year, which shows the extensive network of wagonways in the 18th century. Now, these were still developing in the early 19th century. For instance, the Heston Colliery Railway, which opened in 1822, was fully steam hauled, the first one to be fully steam hauled. Plateways with the flange on the rail rather than the wheels were also widespread, found in South Wales, other parts of England, and up in Scotland. Most early railways were horse hauled, of course, but Salamanca, the other illustration here, works the Middleton Railway just outside Leeds from 1812. And a Trevithick locomotive hauled 50 tons, 10 miles in South Wales in 1804. But all of these railways were private railways built and run for the benefit of their owners, and they weren't for public use. Oh, come on. Why aren't you? So it worked earlier. There we go. There were also early public railways, those that were open for anyone to use for a payment of a fee or toll. The Swansea and Oystermouth was probably the earliest railway to have a regular passenger service, starting in 1807. All of these early railways well, the early railways in England are discussed in this research volume by David Gwynn and Neil Cossons that Historic England published in 2017 and is available on our website. And David Gwynn's book, which was published in 2023, I think, it is goes into much more detail and covers the whole world, and is well worth a read. But these railways, these early public railways, were actually all horse hauled. So what makes the S&DR special is that it was designed from the start as a locomotive hauled public railway. Its company motto was private risk for public benefit. Transportation of coal was always expected to be the company's biggest earner, but its 1823 Act of Parliament, giving permission for the construction of the line and permitting the use of locomotives, did not restrict what could be carried, and passengers were specifically included within the terms of the Act. Thus, apart from the opening day, passengers were generally transported in horse-drawn stagecoaches until the early 1830s. Was actually down to the limited availability of steam locomotives. The other thing about the Stockton Darlington Railway was that it was the first really extensive use of wrought iron rails rather than cast iron or timber rails of earlier railways. And it was also designed from the start as the start of a network. Edward Pease, the industrialist who was the main driving force behind the railway, stated in 1821 the expectation that you would in due course be able to catch a train from Edinburgh to London. And that's in 1821 that he came out with that concept. The S&DR also proved to be highly profitable, and they were able to pay a dividend to their shareholders from the very first year. And by the 1830s, the return was in double digits. Now, to secure the supply of steam locomotives for the railway, Edward Pease, this chap who was the main backer of the railway, helped George and Robert Stephenson to set up Robert Stephenson and Co. here in Newcastle in order to build locomotives. Now, possibly because of this investment, the S&DR in its early years follows a policy of being very open with visiting engineers and promoters of other railways. Presumably, Edward Pease was hoping that Robert Stephenson and Co. would be selling locomotives to these other railways as well. So he was very, the S&DR was very open and free with their information about the running of the railway. So there was a succession of, can we do that? No. That's it. So I click that and then down there. Never mind. Yeah, that's. I have fully scripted this, but it's clearly not working terribly well. So there was a real succession of engineers and rail promoters from all across Europe, in this country, and a whole succession of people over from the United States. So, for instance, I've forgotten the chap's name, but one of the visitors from the United States was involved with the Baltimore and Ohio Railway. Now, its railway was originally gauged at 4'3", but after visiting the Stockton Darlington Railway, where Timothy Hackworth had added half an inch to the Killingworth gauge of 4'8", to end up with 4'8.5", which is now standard gauge in this country. the Baltimore and Ohio Railway re-gauged their line to match the Stockton Darlington Railway. And that's why standard gauge is standard gauge in the US as well as in this country and in various other places around the world. Has that moved? Oh, come on. Let's try the clicker. There we go. So is there much to see today? Well, yes, there is. Again, if you check out the Friends website, there you can download a whole series of walkbooks, guides of walkbooks, or buy pre-printed ones. Another plug for them. There we go. So let's look at the railway. The line that opened in 1825 starts off at collieries around Wiston Park near Etherley, goes over a couple of inclines at Etherley and Brosselton. The level area between the two over the Gorners Valley was horse halls. And then what then became New Shildon, that's where the locomotive haulage started. And then it ran all the way down to the River Tees at Stockton, with short branch lines at Darlington and Yarm. The one in Yarm opening a month after the rest of the line opens in September 1825. Now, a lot of the evidence of the western end, lots of the evidence of the western end of the line for coal mining and so forth has been lost to open casting. This view here, this is the Thomas Dixon plan of 1839 of the map of the main line, and if you overlay the LiDAR image, that's the Beltsgill embankment, which is at the foot of the Etherley incline, shows up really quite nicely. And that's the embankment with a person, with one of the friends of the Stockton and Darlington Railway at the bottom, give you a bit of a sense of scale. Now, this embankment, which still has an 1825 stone line culvert carrying water through the base of it, was basically constructed with spoil excavated from further up the incline. Now, we don't know how it was constructed, whether it was constructed in layers or just as a fingertip of spoil. David Gwynn reckons that early railway embankments were basically fingertipped rather than constructed as layers, but we really don't know. The SNDR first obtained authorising Act of Parliament in 1821 for a horse-drawn wagonway designed by George Overton. But the same day that Act of Parliament was passed, Edward Pease was meeting George Stephenson and changed his mind and decided that no, we're not going to go horse-drawn, we're going to go locomotive drawn. So he got George Stephenson to redesign the routes for locomotive use. And this plan here, which shows Overton's routes in blue with Stephenson's routes in red, illustrates the change quite dramatically. In that Overton's routes basically contoured round, minimising the amount of earthworks that you require and minimising inclines, whereas George Stephenson thought, no, let's throw lots of engineering at this. We'll build powered inclines straight up hills, straight back down again, and then once we get onto the more level area from Shildon onwards, we're going to cut straight across everything. And it's much straighter routes. It was shorter, and despite the amount of engineering, it proved to be cheaper to construct. At the summit of the Etherley incline, the SNDR constructed an engine house and a pair of cottages, one for the engine man and one for a fireman come blacksmith. Water for the steam raising came from a pair of circular ponds, which LiDAR shows that one of them still actually holds water. You can just about see the faint image of the second one. Remarkably little of the engine house and remarkably little evidence of the two buildings up there. The engine house was demolished sometime in the early 20th century, and the cottages actually still survived as late as about 1980 before being demolished by the local authority. The engine that was that was installed here was designed by Robert Stevenson, and was originally designed just to haul the 1 kilometre incline up from Witton Park. The 2 kilometre incline down to the Gorners Valley was originally designed as being self-acting. Basically, the weight of the descending coal wagons would then draw the empties up via a winding wheel at the top. Now, Timothy Hackworth, who was the superintendent of steam engines, he redesigned the system in 1827 so that the two inclines were operated in tandem. It's with the weight of the descending train helping the engine haul up the other incline. And the two different lengths of incline were accommodated by different diameter winding wheels at the top. This here is a working model of the steam engine, which was actually made in 1836 and still survives. Initially, the engine man was a chap called Thomas Greener, who went on to move to work on the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1826. He was replaced by his brother John, who kept the job all the way through until 1843, when unfortunately he then slipped and fell underneath the arm of the steam engine when it was in motion and was crushed to death. That probably saw the abandonment of the incline. By that stage, traffic down the incline had actually declined quite a lot because of exhaustion of the pits and the opening of another railway line. But it wasn't actually finally decommissioned until the 1850s. At the bottom of the Etherley incline, that's okay, which now we want the pointer. Here's a pointer, that one. Right, okay. No. Maybe a laser pointer that actually worked. There we go. Yeah. So this is the bottom of the Etherley incline here. Joins the junction with the Hagglesas branch here, which opens in 1830. Now, the Hagglesas branch, which connected further coal mines around Cockfield Fell, was the first line that was designed by Robert Stevenson, George's son. And Robert got the bill of Parliament through in 1823. But the line wasn't actually constructed until the late 1820s. Now, this line here then gets connected in 1856 to this branch line here, which brought locomotives to the first time into the Gorners Valley. This one here, which then connects to the rest of the network via a tunnel underneath Shildon. This here is the original 1825 horse-hauled main line going towards the Brusselton incline. And here, at this junction, there is the Gorners Bridge, which we'll talk about later. And here, it's West Auckland Station, which is... Ah, yes. The other thing I was going to say about this slide is that it's on the ground, it's very noticeable. The scale of the earthworks of the 1856 branch line is so much more massive than the earthworks of the 1825 main line. That's which just goes to show that that the development of the railways in such a short amount of time. At this junction, you get this get West Auckland Station, and the station master's house still survives and it's still in domestic use. Now, you could argue that the Stockton Darlington Railway effectively invented the idea of the station master's house. It's very early on, they got into the habit of building workers' accommodation, which was presumably a cunning way of ensuring 24-hour supervision of their properties. And it's interesting because other early railways, like the Liverpool and Manchester and the Newcastle and Carlisle, don't seem to have followed that same idea until after they've got rolling and so forth. And yet, you know, the classic rural station in the Victorian period is basically a house for your station master, plus one or two other bits that might be needed, but it's the station master's house that's the most important thing. Now, this is the Gornless Bridge. So the crossing of the Gornless has been described as the world's first iron railway bridge. Quietly ignoring the fact that there are at least two earlier ones in South Wales. But there we go. Now, the ones in South Wales carried narrow gauge plateways rather than standard gauge railways. So maybe this is the first railway bridge. Does it really matter? The other thing about the Gornless Bridge is I suspect that this never actually carried locomotives. When it was built, this part of the line was always horse hauls. And by the time it gets the locomotives come into the valley, it then becomes it gets bypassed and it's used as a siding. In 1901, it gets replaced with a plate girder bridge because a new colliery opens up on the south side of the Gornless and they need to get locomotives in. But thankfully, they recognised it as a brilliant bit of engineering, and it was saved. And this is now being restored and is on display at Shildon. We think those are the original colours. They did a paint scrape analysis, and those are the bottom colours, which is really quite interesting for a largely Quaker-run railway. Another fascinating thing about this bridge, not just the lenticular truss design, which uses a combination of cast and wrought iron in its construction, is that this bridge is all slots together. There aren't any bolts. It's flat pack furniture almost. But there we go. A little further along from the Gornless is Hummerbeck Bridge, which is probably the best surviving of or the least altered of the 1825 bridges. And it's got that classic roll moulding round the arch, round the arch there. Brosselton Accommodation Bridge, which is a little further on, was originally thought to be 1825 as well. But archive research by by one of the friends of Stockton Darlington Railway turned up records of this and another bridge being built in 1833 as accommodation bridges. Now, I suspect that the reason why this bridge gets built then is that that's after the opening of the Hagaleses branch, when the amount of traffic going up the Brosselton incline goes up quite dramatically, and this basically replaces a level crossing. Now, accommodation bridges was one of the things that the Stockton Darlington Railway didn't really cost for, and that's in their initial construction, which is one of the reasons why they were running into really severe financial difficulties in 1825, just before opening. And we'll come on to that a bit later. So this view, the view on the right, is actually one of my photos. There we go, which is taken looking down the hill, down towards that incline, that accommodation bridge, neatly showing off the sleeper stones. And the book cover there shows the view in the opposite direction. Up at the top of the Brosselton incline, you've got 1 and 2 old engine houses. Number 2 old engine house is actually the 1825 engine house. That's the one. That's the building that looks like it's a lean-to, although it's number 1. The one with the roof slope facing you, is actually built off the coining of number 2. So it's actually a later building. Yeah, so the original engine here, again, was designed by Robert Stephenson, and it was originally designed as a marine engine for a paddle steamer. It was a, okay, if anyone into the nitty-gritty details, it was a twin-cylinder condensing steam engine generating 60 horsepower. There we go, double that of the ethanol engine. And it was estimated to cost nearly £3,500, but records suggest that it's actually only cost £2,750, which was approximately 4.5 times the cost of a locomotive of the time. Now, the 2 German engineers, Oeynhausen and Dechen, who visited twice, once in 1826 and 1827, described the engine in detail and described that steam was raised in 2 16-foot boilers. Now the incline here was also planned by Charles Minard when he after visiting in 1833. Now this was after the Hagalieses branch line opened, and the amount of traffic going over Broston was too much for the Stephenson locomotive, for the Stephenson stationary engine. So the Stockton Darlington Railway invested in a new 80 horsepower engine with a new boiler chimney, which, oh, it also has a photo. Right, okay. So that there, so can I use the pointer? Right, so this here, that there is the original 1825 engine house. The gable end there, that's the gable end of the workers' cottages that were built. And this construction here, this engine house with the chimney, gets built in 1831. So if we slot back, now it's by the time that in the late 1820s, Hackworth. The original arrangement was just a single rope hauling up and then dropping down, and then hauling up and then dropping down. Hackworth then changes the arrangement with 2 drum wheels, which suggests that he changed it to work the same way as the etherly incline, so hauling them alternately in tandem. But by the time John Raystrick visited in 1825, they'd reverted to single rope working again, possibly because the other rope had snapped again. There's lots of records of these ropes snapping. By the time the 1831 engine house gets installed, it goes back to this tandem working, and also introducing these things known as kips. So this here is the cross section. So basically, you get hauled up here up to G, and then that slight drop down, which allows you to, once the train starts dropping down there, it allows you to quickly disconnect the rope from the front, run round the back whilst it's still running, to attach it onto the back, so that it then allows it to drop down. Hate to have that job, but there we go. That's how they ran it, and this works like that until the Shildon Tunnel was opened in 1842, if I remember rightly, and then kept on standby in case there was a blockage with the tunnel until 1856, when it was finally decommissioned. Now, so the 1856 map shows the 1831 setup. by 1896, that has all been swept away and been replaced by a load of housing. This basically became an outstation for the workers down at the coachworks down at Shildon. But in the 1960s, all that late 19th century housing was swept away, basically just leaving the original 1825 buildings. As you can see, that comparison there. So that there is the engine house there. So at the bottom of the Branse-Instone incline, you get to what became New Shildon. It's at the bottom of the hill from Shildon proper, which is up on top of the hill. It's probably as a legacy of the 150th anniversary in 1975. We've actually got quite a few buildings still surviving down there, which is now part of the Locomotion Railway Museum. Soho House was the house that was occupied by Timothy Hackworth, the railway engineer. And his locomotive works was basically arranged all around the house. Historic England has produced a historic area assessment of this area as well. So if you're interested, do check that out on our website. One of the buildings is this one. This was originally identified as being 1833, the world's first locomotive shed. That first thing. Ignore the railway first, it's far too problematic. It actually turns out that this building is older. It was built in 1826 by a local iron merchant as a rail-served iron depot. But it later got used by the North Eastern Railway as a paint shop for locomotives when it acquired the chimney, which you can see on the side there, which was part of a underfloor heating system to help the paint dry on the locomotives. A bit further along, you've got this strange collection of buildings known as Black Boy Stables. Now, the name the name Black Boy is probably associated with the branch line, the Black Boy incline, which runs behind it. There's no evidence that any of these buildings were ever stables. And in fact, most of the buildings appear to relate more to the Surtees branch line, which passes directly in front of the buildings, rather than the Black Boy incline that passes to the rear. The central building is potentially a goods shed that the S&DR builds in the 1840s. We've got a documentary record to that, and we haven't identified which building it is. And Castle Cabin, so called because it had crenellations, I reckon was probably, you could probably call it a proto-signal box. It overlooks the junction between the 1825 main line and these two branch lines that come in. And in design, with the crenellations, it matches another small building which overlooks another junction a bit further down the line. So we're not talking. Signal boxes with lever frames and things like that. This is basically a shelter for the person who's in charge of changing the points and possibly waving trains down and so forth. And it's shown on the Castle Cabin is the earliest building that's shown on a map of 1840. And then next door to it is this remarkable structure, which we've got another research report for. This is a locomotive coaling, the coaling depot. Basically, designed in 1846 to be able to rapidly fill tenders with coal, which you would have thought is fairly obvious. Why not use gravity to fill your tenders with coal? But remarkably, that the Great Western Railway was still building coaling stages in the 1930s that relies on a chap with a shovel. But there we go. And a picture from that wonderful book showing an aerial view of of this coal depot, which has also been restored with some help because of the Heritage Action Zone. So Shildon, there's lots of other things to see in Shildon. For instance, the original gates from Euston Station. Why in Shildon? It's a railway place. The reconstruction of a dandy cart, that was a cart that was designed to give horses a rest on downhill sections. There's a display of different sorts of tracks that's used on the SNDR, right next door to where locomotion started on its initial journey in 1825. And the statue there is Timothy Hackworth, holding a model of the Royal George, which was his 1827 steam locomotive, which probably did more to prove the worth of steam haulage than locomotion did, because it worked first time, unlike locomotion. A bit further down the line from the Shildon Railway Museum is this bridge, Pickley Bridge. Now that cast iron section there, which is an incredible length, this is an accommodation bridge, an accommodation bridge. You would never want to put any sort of train over that, but it was designed for cattle, really. So it allowed the local farmers to drive his cattle over the railway line. And the reason why this bridge ends up getting extended and extended and extended, this is over the marshalling yard, which at its height included 27 miles of sidings. Which, if you're into world firsts and things like that, was supposed to be the world's largest marshalling yard up until about 1927, with a bigger one that opened just outside Chicago. Now, the Round Arch Bridge, that section there, is a bit of an oddity. In gauge, it looks as though it could be an 1825 bridge, but it's not shown by the Ordnance Survey in 1856, which only shows a level crossing here. So we don't actually, but by that stage, it's too narrow, really, to have been built as a bridge over a line, because the loading gauge has increased by the 1850s. Now, another interesting thing about this bridge, if you look carefully, there are some connectors for electric cabling. Now, this section of line between Shildon and Newport was electrified in 1916 with a 1,500 volt DC system, which definitely wasn't a world's first or anything like that, but it's relatively early. Unfortunately, it didn't prove to be economic to maintain, and they reverted to steam haulage in 1935. A bit further down, the next station is Newton Aycliffe Station. And here's another oddity. There's a short section of stone sleeper track, which is now mainly buried in ballast and has lost its iron rails. But it first appears on the 1914 map, but there's no railway line here in 1896. Why on earth we've got a section of 1825 style line suddenly appear round about 1914 at the early 20th century? We don't know. One initial thought was it was part of the 100th anniversary, but it's too early for that. And but there we go. Then we get to Hayington. Now, is this effectively the world's first railway station? Okay, so now this is built on a level crossing of Aycliffe Lane, which runs between the villages of Aycliffe and Hayington, which in 1825 was in the middle of nowhere, but it was the closest point to Newcastle from the Great North Road. And this is where locomotion was first put on the tracks after being carted down from Newcastle. Now, the Stockton Darlington Railway built a coal depot here, and then following on an idea from their chairman, who built a public house next door to the coal depot Yarm, which suddenly made an awful lot of money because lots of people travelling long distances to buy their coal just needed somewhere to drink and sit down and recuperate. So again, the Stockton Darlington Railway thinks, oh, I know, we need some supervision at this coal yard. If we build a building, get a license for it, we can then rent it to someone at a premium and make even more money. What a good idea. So that's what they tried doing. Unfortunately, they didn't reckon on the local magistrates, who were shareholders of the local turnpike trust, no friends of the railway. So they said, you want a license? No. So they didn't manage to get their license in 1827. Few newspaper articles in the Durham Courier, I think, to claim, how awful it is. This is really important for the place for people to take shelter for cashing trains and things like that. The SNDR also then take it to court to try and there are court proceedings where there's written witness statements of lots of people talking about coming here to catch trains on their commutes to work. And this is 1828. There's also records of parcels being dropped off and picked up from here. Passenger services from here that aren't run at this time by the Stockton Darlington Railway. It's all franchised out to public houses generally. But it's quite possible that the chap that was renting this place was also acting as a booking agent for these people. It's also used as a watering point for steam locomotives. We know that because Locomotion's boiler blows up here in 1828 whilst taking on water, unfortunately killing the driver and injuring the brother of the tenant. Eventually, it does get its license in 1829, and by 1833, it's definitely acting as a railway station, and it operates as a railway station all the way through until the early 1970s. Unfortunately, it's looking a bit sad at the moment, and the Friends of the Stockton Darlington Railway are trying to raise money in order to buy it and bring it back into use. Now, the plan on the side there, that T-shaped building, that's the original building as mapped in 1828. Opposite that is this signal box, which is actually one of the earliest classic signal boxes surviving in the country. It dates to 1872, and if you're a signal box spotter, this is a, let's get this right, North Eastern Railway Central Division Type C1 box. There we go. So, yes, signal boxes. There are lots of different types with different code names to them, which can really get quite fascinating. Now, this sort of classic signal box with the ridge running parallel to the railway tracks, brilliant idea because they're very easily extendable. This box was extended in 1912. And you can only tell that by a very, very slight different colour of brickwork here. You see it's slightly lighter. That's the extension. There we go. The next crossing down is, I can never remember, Coton Lane. That's it. Now this building, again, there's a coal depot here, but it doesn't get a building until after 1840, when this building gets added, probably as a requirement of the Board of Trade, which in the 1840s is starting to get a bit twitchy about people being run over by trains on level crossings and things like that. Now, apparently, this building had no water supply well into the 20th century, and it was supplied on the first train every morning with bottled water. But there we go. And the other thing to say about this, you can probably guess which side of the building faces the tracks. The one with all the windows. Yeah. A bit further down the line is Dean Beck and another 1825 accommodation bridge. And you can tell it's an 1825 bridge, same design. That's that neat roll moulding. And that's Hummerbeck Bridge. Now, after crossing the A1M on a modern bridge, of course, the line crosses a boggy area known as Myers Flat. Now, Overton's 1821 route very sensibly avoided this by a circuitous route. George Stephenson thought, nah, let's cut straight across it. So that's what he did. It took far more material dumping into a bog to create an earthwork than he was expecting. And the locals chuckled, oh, it's the local fairies trying to stop you building your railway line. But eventually it was built. But I understand it still suffers from a fair amount of subsidence, as this bridge here does include, we think, some 1825 work. But the number of telltales that are all over that bridge is quite scary, actually. But there we go. The next station is Darlington. Now, it's Darlington North Road. Now, Darlington's main railway station, Darlington Bank Top on the East Coast Main Line, was built by the Great North of England Railway, which later becomes the North Eastern Railway. But it actually gets built on the Croft branch line that was built by the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which opens in 1828, something like that. Darlington's original station is this one at North Road. But this building here is actually 1842. The Darlington station itself evolves over time. Now, bear in mind, in 1825, no one had really run a railway on this sort of scale. And the entire concept of a railway station is something new. It's something that gets developed. So this is the Dixon Plan of 1839. And the first thing that gets built is a coal depot down at the end of the Darlington branch line. So that's the Darlington branch line coming in here, and that's the main line going that way, and that's Skerne Bridge, which we'll talk about in a bit. So there's a coal depot. Then the Railway Hotel, another one of these early pubs that the Stockton Darlington Railway decided to build, and again, they have difficulty getting a license. So this doesn't get a license until 1829. In fact, the railway even builds a brewery because they work out that they don't need a license for off sales from a brewery. So that's how they get around it in 1828. They then get a license for the hotel, and suddenly the brewery goes bankrupt, which they then feel a bit bad about because the person they've rented it to, then loses money. So they end up giving him a job elsewhere. Quaker paternalism for you. Now, the passenger services actually operate from the level crossing of the Great North Road, that's about 350 metres up the road from the Railway Hotel. In 1827, they built the first merchandising station, which is basically a transshipment goods shed. And it was designed to be able to be rented out to 3 separate hauliers as 3 separate units. In 1833, it gets rapidly converted into a passenger station. And then later on, it then gets converted into housing, which is this illustration from Bill Fawcett's book in 2001, by which time the level crossing is replaced by a bridge. In 1833, to allow the original merchandise station to be converted into a passenger station, they built a new goods station. which is now the entrance building for Hopetown Railway Museum. And in the 1830s, they built a coach shed on the north side of the tracks. Now, the coach station that they originally built is more for the benefit of their coaches than for passengers. Basically, early coaches, of course, were timber built, and you want to store them overnight under cover. So early coach stations were really somewhere to shelter your coaches from the weather, rather than necessarily for passenger use. And then by 1842, you get the North Road station finally built. Although it's interesting that it says new coach station on the Dixon Plan of 1839. I haven't actually bottomed that out, whether whether it was planned by that stage or whether there was an earlier building that gets replaced in 1842. So that's the first railway hotel, potentially. It's certainly called that in 1829. And it's still operating as a pub. So do go and frequent. Very good beer in there. There we go. Another plug. It's lots of plugging. There we go. Hopetown Railway Museum at Darlington also has this reconstruction of the SNDR's first the passenger coach called Experiment, which actually only ran for until 1827, by which time it was it became a shed at the bottom of the Bruston Incline until it was burnt down a few years later. Again, this is an illustration from the Friends book. Now, this reconstruction is based on archive research by one of the Friends of the Stockton Darlington Railway, their president, Niall Hammond. And it's mainly based on a sketch, an eyewitness sketch that was made by the 14-year-old son of Jonathan Backhouse. It's on the opening day in 1825. You know, the other classic illustrations of Experiment, which makes it look like a garden shed, are based on an illustration that wasn't produced until the 1850s. So the merchandise station and Skerne Bridge. So a little further on from North Road, you've got Skerne Bridge, which is the most impressive engineering structure on the entire line. This painting, which is in Preston Park Museum, we think is probably 1830 because it shows a horse-drawn coach. The engine looks about in keeping for about 1830, but more importantly, Skerne Bridge has got wing walls. And it only gets wing walls in 1829. So that's Skerne Bridge. That's Skerne Bridge. Now, talking about HS2, how long has it taken to do HS2? Okay, so here, how about this for a timeline for you? Okay, foundations for this bridge get put in early summer 1824. At that stage, George Stephenson's still planning on building an iron bridge here. The Stockton the board. There's some evidence that the board are a bit twitchy about an innovative iron bridge on such a significant river crossing as here. There's an awful lot of traffic's going to have to go over this. They're estimating that it will need to carry 10,000 tonnes of coal a year. By October, George Stephenson writes to the secretary and says, having thought about it some more, because the price of iron's gone through the roof, I recommend we get Ignatius Bonamy, who's the Durham Inspector of Bridges, to build a masonry bridge, as long as it won't fall down. That's in his letter. So that's October the 19th that letter gets sent. Bonamy gets asked by the board to design a bridge, and he comes up with a design a week later. Right, this is in November 1824, and the final bills for the completed bridge get paid in June 1825. I think HS2 could learn a lot. But there we go. Now, 10,000 tons this bridge was designed to carry. It's by 1827, it was carrying over 50,000 tons a year. And the embankment, earthwork embankments approaching the bridge were starting to fail. And John Carter, who was the railway's inspector of masonry, in 1825, he adds the wing walls shown in that painting there. The wing walls that are there now are later 19th century. But the remarkable thing about this bridge is it's still carrying traffic today. It has been for 200 years. A bit further along in Darlington, you've got another accommodation bridge, which is now the pedestrian the subway underneath Tornado Way, which is now a main road. And this image from Northern Archaeological Associates' evaluation report for that road actually shows that there is the original 1825 bridge, which here is it gets widened in 1833 when they dual tracked a line, and then it gets widened further in the later 19th century to accommodate sidings. Further along the line, the original main line, it's between the Darlington bypass and Oakley Junction, where the National Rail Network picks up the 1825 line again, is now a cycle route. In fact, part of the Heritage Action Zone is a walking cycle route for the entire 27 miles of the original 1825 line. So we were talking about pubs earlier. This one is the one that starts the ball rolling. This is the Cleveland Bay. It opens in October 1825 at the same time as the Yarm branch line. And this is built right at the end of the Yarm branch line, overlooking the coal depot. And it was built privately by the chairman of the Stockton Darlington Railway. There we go. It's and again, it's a pub that's still in use, so do go and visit. A bit further, if you go from the Cleveland Bay towards Stockton, you're travelling along the route of the old Turnpike Road. And that Turnpike Road is the Turnpike Road that was the famous race between a stagecoach carrying 16 passengers hauled by 4 horses against locomotion carrying hauling 27 wagons, most of them filled with coal, and also 600 passengers. Wonder who won? It was locomotion. Yeah. And this section of line gets abandoned in 1856, is it? Something like that, with the line between Stockton and Leeds, which is now the part of the National Rail Network. And the earthworks survive really quite well in the grounds of Preston Park Museum, which of course is based around Preston Park, which is a big stately home, I think. And this plan here is the John Harris survey of 1846. And I love how this shows a little bit of toll dodging. So do you see there's a toll gate there? We've got 2 entrances into the park, one provided via a bridge and one provided by a level crossing, either side of the toll gate. So the chap who lives at Preston Park never pays a toll to use the turnpike roads in this section, but there we go. And then you get to St John's Well at Stockton, so the Stockton terminus. Now again, 1825, 1825, no one had built a railway terminus for a railway network. What does it need? The Stockton Darlington Railway, also by 1825, was getting desperate for money, because not only had the price of iron gone up through the roof, but they'd also underestimated the amount of legal costs dealing with all the landowners that they were having to purchase land off to build the line. those legal costs were far in excess of anything they expected. And then on top of that, there was the cost of all the accommodation crossings that they were having to build to try and offset to accommodate all these landowners. So by the summer of 1825, they were desperate to start generating income. So in September, when they opened, they weren't really ready. So what they did have, they had at least some temporary buildings down at the quayside. We think they probably had a coal stake, and they had started building a coal depot at St John's Well. St John's Well was where they'd actually laid the first rail in 1823. Now this coal depot is right next door to the bridge across the North Yorkshire. This depot was where they were expecting to make most of their money, because they were really expecting to make most of their money through land sale of coal, not shipping it down the Tees down to London. So they built a coal depot, but they don't actually commission a weigh house until November, and it doesn't get built until it eventually gets occupied in April 1826. And yet the weighing machine isn't installed until July. So presumably all the way up until then, they're basically charging people by, yeah, okay, that looks about full. Okay, yeah, and doing it that way. But who knows? Who knows? So how myths are made. So this building here, this is that weigh house that gets built around the end of 1825, early 1826. And it was lived in by Percival Tully, who was the Stockton Darlington Railway's agent. Now, Percival Tully was the chap that took passenger bookings in 1825, but he probably did that from his office on Cottage Row, which was, do you see that block up at the top there, here? The Stockton Darlington Railway has an office in this that they rented off the council up there. So this building was definitely not. This plaque gets unveiled in 1925 by the future King George VI. Here in 1825, the Stockton Darlington Railway Company booked the first passenger, thus marking an epoch in the history of mankind. Wonderful. Yeah, the Stockton Darlington, it has been a wonderful marketing opportunity for all sorts of people over the years, which is part of the reason why we're celebrating it this year. It's because there are wonderful myths like this. But the thing about the Stockton Darlington Railway is that it is incredibly significant, because, as the friends of the Stockton Darlington Railway have phrased it, it was the railway that got the wheels on track, because they were so open with sharing their information with other railway companies and developers. You can see there that the influence of the Stockton Darlington Railway all across the world. So the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, without the Stockton Darlington Railway, they might have ended up using rope haulage for the entire line. That was initially their preferred option, until they came and saw how the Brussels incline didn't work so well, whereas the locomotives did. And there are also there are connections with other railways, like the Leeds to Selby Railway. The Leeds to Selby Railway, they open with intermediate stations, for instance, as does Newcastle and Carlisle, which a lot of it appears to be models potentially on things that the Stockton and Darlington Railway were developing. And yet the Stockton and Darlington Railway, for instance, they don't call railway stations until 1840. And equally well, they learn from other people. So they adopt ticketing system from the Newcastle and Carlisle Railway, for instance, which is a wonderful thing about pioneering. you share ideas, learn from each other, and here we are.